In the winter of 1609, inside a wooden fort on a swampy island in Virginia, 500 English men, women, and children began to starve. They ate the horses first, then the dogs, the cats, and the rats in the walls, then the leather of their own shoes, and when there was nothing left that had ever been alive, a few of them turned to the only meat that remained, each other. By the spring of 500 souls, barely 60 were still breathing. The survivors gave that winter a name. They called it simply the starving time. This was Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in America, the seed the whole nation would one day grow from. We remember it now as a fairy tale, a brave captain, an Indian princess, a rescue at the very last second. The truth is darker and far stranger. It is a story of gold madness and mass death, of a colony that twice tried to run for its life, and of the single year it received the two things that would define America forever: the first government elected by the people and the first ship of enslaved human beings. But before any of that, it had to survive itself. It began in the spring of 1607. 3 small ships, 105 men sailing 50 miles up a river they named the James for their king. They chose a low island, easy to defend, they thought, and began to build. But look at who England had sent. Not farmers, gentlemen, gold hunters, jewelers, perfumers, a long list of men with soft hands and grand names, and barely a dozen among them who knew how to swing an axe. They had crossed an ocean to get rich quick. They had no idea they had come to a place that was about to kill most of them. The ground they had chosen was a trap. The water was brackish and foul, the marsh bred fever, and the summer turned the little fort into a graveyard. Men dropped from disease and bad water faster than the living could dig the graves. By the middle of September, barely 3 months ashore, half of them were dead. At one point, only 5 men were well enough to stand guard at the walls. The rest lay in their own filth, waiting to die. The great English Empire in America had begun, and it was already almost over. One man refused to let it end. Captain John Smith, soldier, adventurer, and by his own telling the hero of a dozen impossible escapes. Some called him a braggart. Perhaps he was. But he was also the only real leader the colony had. That winter, out searching for food, Smith was taken prisoner by the warriors of Powhatan, the chief who ruled almost every nation for 100 miles in every direction. They dragged him before the old king. 2 great stones were laid down. His head was forced onto them, and a warrior lifted a heavy club to beat out his brains. And then, Smith wrote, the chief's young daughter threw herself across his body, took his head in her arms, and her father stayed the blow. Her name was Matoaka. History would remember her by a nickname, Pocahontas. Now, did it truly happen that way? Smith only told the story years later, once she was famous, and he was a man who embellished a great deal. Historians have argued about it for centuries, but whether or not a girl saved his life that day, the alliance she came to stand for was real, and for a while it was the only reason the fort was fed at all. Smith took command, and he was merciless about it. While the gentlemen dreamed of gold, he forced them to build, to plant, to trade with the natives for corn. When glittering dirt was found in a creek, the whole colony went mad digging it and filled an entire ship with the shining earth to send home, where it was found to be worthless. Smith had no patience for any of it. He gave the idlers one law, and it was simple: he that will not work shall not eat. Anyone who refused to labor would be cast out of the fort to live in the woods or starve. Even that threat barely held them together. Then, in the autumn of 1609, disaster. A bag of gunpowder exploded against Smith's body, tearing a terrible wound, and there was no surgeon in Virginia who could treat it. He boarded a ship for England, and he never set foot in the colony again. The one man who had bullied and beaten and dragged them all into surviving was gone. Winter was coming down over the river, and this time there would be no one to save them. With Smith gone, the fragile peace with Powhatan collapsed into open war. The old chief did the simplest and deadliest thing imaginable. He laid siege. His warriors ringed the fort and killed anyone who came out for food or fresh water. The English were trapped inside their own walls with the cold closing in and the storehouses nearly bare. And so the dying began again. The horses, the dogs, the rats, the shoe leather. 6 of every 10 people inside that fort would not live to see the spring. What happened behind those walls is the darkest chapter in the story of early America. The colony's own leaders later admitted it plainly. Driven out of their minds by hunger, some of the starving dug up the newly buried dead and ate them. One man, the record says, murdered and salted his own wife. When the spring of 1610 finally came, the 60 ragged skeletons who were left made a decision. They were finished. They loaded themselves into the boats, turned their backs on Jamestown, and started down the river to leave Virginia behind forever. They never reached the open sea. As the boats drifted downstream, carrying the last of the colony away from the nightmare, they met another boat rowing up toward them. It was an English longboat, the advance party of a new governor, Lord de la Warr, arriving from England with fresh men and a hold full of supplies at the exact hour the survivors had given up. He ordered them to turn around. Jamestown outlived the starving time by a matter of days, not because of gold, not because of God, because of timing. And what finally made the colony live was not treasure at all. It was a weed. A settler named John Rolfe planted a sweeter strain of tobacco, and England could not get enough of it. Overnight, the deadly swamp was worth a fortune. Rolfe also married the chief's daughter, Pocahontas, now baptized with a Christian name, Rebecca, a wedding that bought a few fragile years of peace. She sailed to England as a living marvel and was paraded before the king. She never came home. She died there, of English disease at around 22 years old, and was buried in a country 3,000 miles from the river where she was born. 10 years after the starving time, Jamestown had finally stopped dying and started to grow. And in the summer of 1619, something happened in that little colony that would echo for 400 years. The settlers gathered the first assembly elected by the people in the history of America, ordinary men meeting to make their own laws. It was a small thing, held in a church, in a swamp, at the edge of a continent. It was also the beginning of American self-government, and in that very same summer, into that very same colony, another ship came up the James. A Dutch vessel short on provisions carrying about 20 captive Africans, and it traded them to the colonists in exchange for food. They were among the first Africans sold into bondage in English America. Liberty and slavery, the ballot and the chain, arrived at Jamestown within weeks of each other on the same brown water. And for the next 250 years, America would grow both of them at once. There was one last reckoning to come. The old chief Powhatan was dead, and his brother, Opechancanough, had watched the English spread across his people's country, seizing more land with every harvest of tobacco. On a spring morning in 1622, he struck. In a single coordinated attack, his warriors killed 347 colonists, men, women, and children, in the space of a few hours. The alliance that Pocahontas had embodied was over. What came after was not a war for territory. It was a war of extermination. And this time, the English would be the ones to win it. In the end, the colony that could barely keep itself alive outlasted the empire that had ruled that land for centuries before it. The Powhatan world, hundreds of towns strong on the day the 3 ships appeared, was broken, scattered, and gone within a single lifetime. So remember what the fairy tale leaves out. Jamestown was not a shining triumph of brave pioneers. It was a near-total catastrophe. The wrong people in the wrong place, who lost most of their number to fever and famine, who ate their own dead, who tried twice to flee, and who survived almost entirely by luck and a profitable weed. And remember what it planted. Not one legacy, but 2, grown from the same soil in the same year, a government by the consent of the governed, and a system of human slavery. The best of what America would one day become, and the very worst of it, born together on a single island 3,000 miles from home. The survivors of the starving time never spoke much about what they had done to stay alive. Who could blame them? They had crossed an ocean chasing gold and found instead a lesson older than any empire, that the land does not care about your flag or your king or your dreams. It asks only whether you can live on it and what you are willing to become in order to try. 400 years later, the fort is a ruin, and the wide brown river runs on past it exactly as it always has. And the question Jamestown leaves carved behind it is the one we have never quite been able to answer. What does it truly cost to build a new world, and who is made to pay the price?